everyone. My name is Caitlin Sidorsky, and I am an associate professor of political science at Coastal Carolina University in Conway, South Carolina. Welcome to our second panel of our four-part webinar series entitled Bearing the Burden. This session is being recorded, it's being live streamed, and it is also going to be reposted on social media as well as other outlets. It is co-sponsored by UConn's Arm Center as well as the Thomas Center at Brown University. My co-organizers for this event are Jennifer Deneen, Carrie Vacian, and Wendy Schiller. We would like to thank Haley Troy, Josh Harden, and Michaela Carey and Melanie Skolnick for their help in organizing this webinar and all of the amazing behind the scenes work that they have done to help this become a reality. This webinar is the second in a four-part series, and in this webinar today, we're going to be learning about the implementation of firearm laws that affect women at the state as well as federal levels. In the really excellent webinar that you can see that had been recorded that's on the Bearing the Burden site, we learned about how the gun violence disproportionately affects women. We learned about elder abuse and domestic violence in the roles that they play in gun violence, as well as how gun violence disproportionately affects communities of color, as well as the specific laws and policies that could better protect women. So some of these laws include extreme risk protection orders, domestic violence restraining orders that include firearm provisions, and background check laws, among others. The federal government, via the Violence Against Women Act and the Lautenberg Amendment from the mid-1990s, prohibits individuals under domestic violence restraining orders or those who have been convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors or felonies from purchasing or accessing a firearm. However, only 28 states prohibit domestic violence misdemeanors from purchasing a firearm, and only 33 remove them as part of domestic violence restraining orders. In other words, states, a large portion of them, are not actually following through on federal law. So today we're going to learn about how these laws are made, how they are adopted, and what the state and federal governments can do to address gun violence affecting women. So our first panelist to discuss gun laws will be Congressman David Cicilline, who represents Rhode Island's 1st District, followed by Lisa Geller, the Director of State Affairs at the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. And we will finish with Greta Gordy Gardner, who is the Chief Legal Officer and co-founder of Ujima, Inc., the National Center on Violence Against Women in the Black community. Each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, speaking on their expertise of the implementation of firearm laws. I will ask the first question once they have finished to kind of get us going, and then we'll open the floor for questions. You can put in a question in the chat feature whenever you'd like. I will use that to guide me once we open the floor for questions. You can also at that time, of course, raise your hand and unmute yourself and ask a question there. We really are excited about this webinar series, and we thank you for joining us and hope that you will join us for the next two. And I will tell you what the next one is at the end of this. And I will turn it over to Congressman Cicilline to begin the discussion by explaining how Congress creates firearm policy and the challenges of enacting firearm laws.
Great. Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you for including me in this webinar on obviously a really important subject. Since I'm the first speaker, I think it's just important to remind everyone kind of how pervasive gun violence is in this country. And as has been mentioned, I think that one of the earlier webinars really provided a lot of evidence about the disproportionate impact on women, and particularly women of color. But I think it's also important to recognize that this is a particularly serious challenge in America. We have a public health emergency with respect to gun violence. It's really a uniquely American problem, and I'm delighted to be part of a conversation about trying to present solutions to it. We have, of course, lots of examples of mass shootings in our country nearly every day. Shooting has now become the leading cause of death for young people in this country, which is really horrifying. And, if you look at the impact or the use of guns as it relates to domestic violence and particularly women victims, the statistics are really staggering. over half of female victims of intimate partner homicide in the United States are killed with a gun. Nearly 1 million women in the United States who are alive today have reported being shot or shot at by an intimate partner. Domestic violence victims are 5 times more likely to be killed when their abuser has access to a firearm. And finally, an astounding 92% of all women killed with guns in high-income nations were from the United States. So we account for 92% of those deaths. So this is a serious problem, gun violence broadly, but particularly gun violence as it relates to women. One of the things that we, in terms of how does Congress act in this space, I would say initially Congress acts too infrequently and too slowly. I have worked on gun legislation from the time I was in the state legislature in Rhode Island, then as mayor of Providence, and now as a member of Congress. And I would say that this is the issue that has been the most difficult to really make a lot of progress on. And although we had some progress in the last Congress with the Safer Communities Act, I think there has been tremendous resistance from people, particularly some of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle in the Republican leadership, to support any common sense gun safety legislation. There's a very strong lobby, that supports a view that the Second Amendment is an absolute right and that the government actually can't restrict or limit in any way an individual's access to firearms, despite the fact the United States Supreme Court has said otherwise in the Heller case. But there's a very substantial, I think, cultural view that, guns are off limits. And so while there is obviously a huge gun lobby and a lot of money that gets spent to elect people who support that position and to defeat people who are promoting common sense gun safety legislation, I think there's something deeper. I mean, there's a kind of long tradition in this country of a connection to firearms that I think doesn't exist in a lot of places. I think we're one of only 3 countries that has in our Constitution a provision that provides the right to bear arms. So there's something uniquely American about some of these challenges. And I think it's one of the reasons that progress has been so slow. We did pass the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. And while it was, an important step because we hadn't really enacted any significant gun safety legislation in decades, it's really just a first step. It included support for states to provide resources to address crisis interventions, domestic assault cases, mental health courts, that kind of thing. It provided provisions that would prevent those convicted of domestic violence from possessing a firearm and to require that they be removed and that they be permitted to, again, have a firearm after 5 years, so long as they haven't had any intervening misconduct. It also, provided some enhancements in persons under 21 that are trying to access a firearm, and created a grant program for an encouragement to states to create red flag laws. So, a good amount of resources, a good first step, but still lots more that Congress needs to do in this space. And we do have a number of bills that are currently pending and bills that were introduced in the last Congress that will be reintroduced in this Congress that will create, a federal red flag law so that anyone who believes someone is a danger to themselves or others can petition a court to have a firearm removed. Obviously, the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which we just passed, but there are a number of other provisions that specifically target domestic abusers, those either accused or convicted of that. And the last thing I just want to mention is obviously there's a terrible decision from the Fifth Circuit that was recently decided, in which the court held that a provision that prevented a person accused of domestic violence from having a firearm was unconstitutional. I expect that that will be taken to the United States Supreme Court if it hasn't already happened. And so the Supreme Court also is reshaping the way it looks at some of the jurisprudence around the Second Amendment. And it appears as if they're going to move away from, and have moved away from actually, as a result of the Bruin decision, a standard which gave more deference to state statutes to limit access to firearms, to this sort of new test, which is how has this firearm or access to this firearm historically been treated, which is kind of hard to grapple with when you think about things like assault weapons, which didn't exist when the Second Amendment was adopted. So it's hard to know how it was historically viewed. But I think we're likely to see a Supreme Court that is going to make common sense gun safety legislation even harder to implement, even if Congress passes it. So I'll stop there, look forward to the questions. But there's a lot of interest. I'll just finally say a lot of great advocates for common sense gun safety legislation in the Congress. We have fighting against a very powerful gun lobby that has really stood in the way of real progress. We passed the assault weapons ban in the last Congress by just 2 votes in the House, but obviously couldn't get a vote in the Senate. And all of that work will continue. And a lot of great champions here working specifically on the issue of, women who are victims of gun violence and what we can be doing as a federal government to reduce those numbers. So thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Next, we have Lisa Geller, who is the Director of State Affairs at Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, who will discuss her thoughts on state responses to firearm violence broadly.
All right, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that. So thank you, Caitlin, for moderating, and to UConn and Brown for having me and having all of us today to talk about this very important conversation. So we just heard from Congressman Cicilline about what's going on at the federal level, and I am here to fill in some of those gaps of what's happening at the state level. In my role as the Director of State Affairs for Johns Hopkins, I work with lawmakers at the state level, with advocates, community members, to make sure that protections exist in your state to keep people safe from gun violence. I'm also a researcher, and I have conducted research into the role of domestic violence in mass shootings and the intersection between domestic violence and firearms. So I'm happy to talk about any of that today. And we've already heard from Congressman Cicilline and from Caitlin a little bit about the epidemiology of gun violence. But I just wanted to first start off with the fact that we are now in 2023 experiencing almost 50,000 gun deaths a year. The latest data we have from the CDC, which was from 2021,
Lisa,
found that, yes.
Lisa, sorry. This is Carrie. We can't see your slides. Do you mind stopping sharing and sharing again? And if not, I can share them for you.
Sure. Yeah, not a problem. What about
there
now?
we go. Now I see them. Yep.
Okay. Great. So I hadn't even gotten into the slides yet. So you didn't miss anything. I was just kind of giving some of that epi to start. So 2021, we had 50,000, almost 50,000 gun deaths, 48,800. And we've also seen the number of domestic violence homicides and domestic violence injuries with firearms go up. We've also seen at the same time, not coincidentally, a really startling increase in gun sales, and especially among first-time gun owners. And there's really been a lot of marketing towards first-time gun owners, towards women, to purchase firearms and keep them in their possession to keep them safe. But what we know, again, from the data that's already been presented, is that more guns don't keep you safe. More guns lead to more gun violence. So the role of state legislation, and hopefully just confirming you can see this slide. Okay, great. So state laws often fill the gaps in federal law. We do.
If you just change the slide, we can't see it. I just see the main title slide still, Lisa.
Oh.
If you change the slide.
Yeah, it should say the role of state legislation.
Mm-mm.
Okay, let's try this one last time. Okay. I don't know what's going on. It's probably my dual monitors that I should not have plugged in. Okay.
It's black.
Yeah, this is not great. Okay, so and of course now it's like making me put in my password. So I'm just gonna talk.
Lisa, how about I share them and you just tell me when to move. But you keep talking and I'll share them.
Okay, great. So state law, as I mentioned, fills the gap in federal legislation. That does not mean that we don't have any federal legislation. We do. And we have more now than we have in the past 30 years, thanks to the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So if you go to slide 2, I just gave some examples, and that's totally fine. You don't even need to make it full screen. I gave some examples of where state laws have filled the gaps that are in federal law. So, for example, there is currently no federal extremist protection order, but 19 states and the District of Columbia have extremist protection order laws. And I'm hoping that next week I can say 20 states in DC, since this legislation is getting very close in Michigan. But these laws, again, don't exist at the federal level. And so we've relied on states to enact extremist protection orders. And part of my job as our state affairs director, and now in my new role as the co-director of our Extremist Protection Order Center at Johns Hopkins, I'm going to work with states that have these laws to help them implement them. But also I'm hoping that more states utilize the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act funding as this impetus to pass extremist protection order laws. Universal background checks are another law that, although they are common sense and supported by the vast majority of people in this country, do not exist at the federal level. But many states have passed universal background check laws. And again, Michigan is another example of a state that is going to pass that legislation this session. And then finally, federal laws to address access to guns by domestic abusers are not nearly as strong as they could be. And so we have relied on state laws and state legislation to fill some of those gaps. For example, in preventing access to guns by individuals convicted of violent misdemeanors, not just domestic violence misdemeanors, but all violent misdemeanors, because we know that those are a significant risk factor for perpetrating other forms of violence. And the same with stalking. Stalking is a significant risk factor for domestic violence homicide, but not all stalking crimes, not all felony crimes or misdemeanor crimes of stalking are firearm prohibitory. And so we really do need robust state legislation to fill some of those gaps. And, this webinar is being co-hosted by a university in Connecticut and a university in Rhode Island. And Rhode Island and Connecticut are continuously some of the states with the strongest gun violence prevention policies and the lowest rates of gun violence. And that is not a coincidence. So again, most action to address gun violence does happen at the state level. And what we're seeing is that states with strong gun violence prevention laws keep strengthening their laws, including Connecticut, including Rhode Island, including New York, Delaware, et cetera. And states with weak laws keep weakening their laws. And that's what we are seeing now in a state like Florida that's poised to pass permitless carry this legislation, this legislative session. Permitless carry is incredibly dangerous, incredibly problematic. And what it says essentially is you don't need a permit. You don't need to prove competency with a firearm in order to carry a firearm pretty much anywhere. And as Congressman Cicilline alluded to, the Supreme Court in Schiller has already made it really clear that the Second Amendment is not absolute. It does not give you the right to carry a firearm anywhere at any time for any reason. There are people and there are places where we can limit access to firearms. And that is incredibly important, especially when we're talking about domestic violence prevention. So I'll just go to the next slide quickly. These are 5 of the policies that we know are backed by evidence and that we support at Johns Hopkins. And all of them have some relation to preventing domestic violence because we know that domestic violence intersects with so many forms of violence. My research found that 70% of mass shootings are connected to domestic violence. We know that there is a connection between suicide and domestic violence. And so all of these policies listed here have been proven to be effective in reducing mass shootings or suicides or homicides or community violence. And it's important that we take a holistic approach because one policy alone is not going to curb this epidemic in the US. We really need a patchwork of policies to make sure that the number of people who shouldn't have a gun are as small as possible, reducing the number of people who can fall through the cracks in both federal and state law. So I'll just go to the next slide. And thank you, Carrie, for sharing your screen. A point I want to get across that I think we all believe in is that domestic violence is not a private issue. It is not something that is untouchable to the public, to lawmakers, to advocates. We need to not be afraid to call out domestic violence as the epidemic that it is. We need to not be afraid to legislate on it, because if we don't, we're putting so many people at risk. We're putting millions of people at risk of being threatened with a gun, being shot at. And so I'm writing a blog right now that's hopefully going to be published in the next couple of weeks with the title that if we want to prevent violent crime, we need to take domestic violence seriously. What we've seen from data at the state level is that many individuals arrested for violent crimes had histories of domestic violence. And so they might have not been arrested for a violent domestic violence crime, but when we look back at their records, at what what their criminal records are, what other risk factors they had, domestic violence keeps popping up. And that's because we know that individuals who commit domestic violence are so much more likely to perpetrate other forms of violence. And then again, I just put in the screenshot to my paper with my colleagues at Johns Hopkins that we published looking at specifically the role of domestic violence in mass shootings in the US. And we can go next slide because I want to hear from Greta and then obviously a conversation. So this is just my email if anyone wants to reach out, and we will continue this conversation for the next a little over an hour. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Finally, we have Greta Gordy Gardner, the Chief Legal Officer of Ujima Inc., who will provide an overview of the role of the judiciary in either preventing or promoting firearm laws, as well as an overview of the disparate impact of firearm violence on women of color.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation. I could talk about this all day, every day. And I especially like to thank the Congressman for really lifting up some of the challenges with the bipartisan Safer Communities Act. So let me set the table. Let me give you a little bit of statistics before I get into my thing. Black women are murdered at a rate almost 3 times more so than white females. And the only other population that has similar rates is that of Native American women. And I'll tell you why that is in just a little bit, because that goes into how policy and implementation sometimes don't work in concert. They can actually work in very different ways. Gun violence occurs in 61% of domestic violence homicides. However, firearms are used in 72% of domestic violence homicides in the Black community. But Black women comprise 14% of the US population, but comprise 31% of domestic violence fatalities. And so Black women are twice as likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner in comparison to white women. So obviously homicides occur in women of all ages and among all races and ethnicities, but young, racial and ethnic minority women are disproportionately impacted, and addressing violence will require an integrated response because, much like the Congressman said, it is a public health issue. It's not a private family matter. And in order to address it, we need the larger community and societal factors that make violence more likely to occur to be addressed. And so at Ujima, some of the legislative initiatives that we're involved in is obviously the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, and also the Family Violence Services and Prevention Act. I'm sorry, I always mix that up. Family Violence Prevention and Services Act. And why they're so significant, particularly as we try to reauthorize FIPSA, and also in the 2022 reauthorization of VAWA, is that we are really advocating for more funding, more capacity building, and the enhancement of community-based organizations that are culturally specific. Because one of the things that we know that when President Biden, when he was a senator and was the first sponsor of the Violence Against Women Act, was that women were dying and that they needed services. And so we wanted to save women. We wanted to prevent domestic violence homicides, but we're still seeing 3 per day. What we know is that we've actually saved more men than women because women didn't have to resort to killing their abusers. We also know that we have saved more white women than we have communities of color, survivors from communities of color, because if you give women resources, they will use them. However, for communities of color, there still are barriers to accessing not only legal remedies, but services by organizations that are addressing domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So at Ujima, what we've done with some of our culturally specific organizations and partners is to say, if we have more options for survivors, that we will be able to address this in a more cohesive, comprehensive, trauma-informed, culturally specific, survivor-centered way. I went to a meeting with some other technical assistance providers. And there was this young Hispanic woman who was a survivor, and she was apologizing for not going to an organization that provided services and preferring to go to a culturally specific organization that addressed domestic violence in the Latinx community. And we all told her, you don't have to apologize. We're so glad that you found services that met your needs. We're so glad that you found services where you could speak your language and people could understand you. We're so glad that you were able to feel safe when you were trying to escape an emergency. So I think one of the things that if I could impart and give an example of how a great legislative initiative could impact resources, that could impact implementation, is, for example, we're so excited that one of the grant programs in the Violence Against Women Act now allows for firearm protocols for surrender and forfeiture to be instituted under the Improving Criminal Justice Responses Grant Program. And here's where that can get really challenging. So for example, if we know in the Black community that firearms are the weapon of choice, that's how Black women are dying. If you go to get a protection order and if you don't qualify because you don't live together, you haven't lived together in 6 months, if you don't have children in common, and if you're not married or you have never been married, you don't get a protection order. And we know that there is a tension between the criminal legal system and the Black community, whether it's calling law enforcement or whether even having to access a prosecutor or going through the criminal legal system, that there could be unintended consequences for the victim, which could include having your children taken from you. It could, you could be the victim of a mutual arrest because there wasn't a predominant aggressor investigation. So there are a whole host of reasons why survivors in the Black community don't access the criminal legal system. So we look to the civil legal system for some type of relief, but you may not even qualify. So when the Congressman was talking about closing the boyfriend loophole, that is kind of important to the Black community because we really want to be able to use protection orders when we feel as if the criminal legal system is not a resource. But even still, let's say hypothetically you're able to access the civil legal system and to get a protection order. And if the abuser has access to a firearm or is in possession legally or illegally, many jurisdictions don't even have a system or a litany to tell the abuser, this is where you take your gun. This is how you can maybe get it back at the expiration of the protection order. This is how you may not ever get it back if you have a lifetime order, etc. And so that's where the rubber hits the road. And let's say, for example, that the abuser does have access to a firearm, but tells the court that they don't. And so in the jurisdiction I worked in Austin, Texas, we created an affidavit where they had to go on the record saying, we don't own, or I don't own a firearm. And so later, if there is proof that they did have access to, or they were in possession of a firearm, that they now have a criminal charge of perjury, or, and an impeachable in the event that there's ever another trial or testimony is required. So I think, for exactly a lot of survivors, even undocumented or those who have immigration status or issues or challenges, like there's such a chilling effect on, these resources or remedies may be available, but they are not built for me. They are not accommodating for me. And I don't feel welcome. I don't feel like I can access these. And there's no one to help me or shepherd me through these processes. I will tell you, I still do some pro bono work on the side because I think it's disingenuous to do policy work without knowing boots on the ground what's going on. And using all of these avenues between civil, legal, criminal, legal, family law. You may have a housing issue. You may have an employment issue if your abuser comes to your job. It is really complicated. And I'm an attorney and I've been a prosecutor. And it can get really, really complicated. And so it has a chilling effect. And so when you talk about immigrant survivors who, even if they have a contact with a system, doesn't necessarily have to be the criminal legal system, her abuser could be deported. That starts a whole bunch of other economic issues that may dissuade her from wanting to use any of the resources available. I think that we really, again, need this concentrated, comprehensive approach to making sure that when we have legislative initiatives, when we hope, obviously we can't please all people all the time at every juncture, but we need as many options as we can possibly muster to make sure that we are keeping people safe in the moment as they are trying to access not only safety, but also justice. And that's going to look very different for different people at different times. I think the one thing that if I can impart and leave everyone with is that, oftentimes when we talk to particularly Black survivors, they feel as though no one will believe them. And that's a compound issue, right? Because survivors of domestic violence seem to have less credibility anyway as they're going through this journey. We're still addressing myths about survivors that, well, they must have provoked it, they must like it, they're still staying, et cetera, et cetera. But when you add to that some of the other things that they experience, for example, if they go to the hospital instead of being believed that they need medical attention and are in pain, and if they ask for pain medication, then they're drug seeking, they're not a survivor of domestic violence who could possibly be experiencing CTE or other brain injuries. We may not call the police because of cultural loyalty, collectivism. We don't want to contribute to putting another Black man into the industrial prison complex. So we sacrifice ourselves because our communities have been destroyed, right? So for not only from intimate partner violence, but family violence and community violence. And we may not call the police because we don't want to be arrested ourselves. I think one of the interesting things that we're trying to reconcile internally with Ujima when we talk about policies, protocols, and legislative initiatives is that on one side, we have this tremendous push for these gun task forces to collect illegal guns and firearms in the streets because illegal guns are dangerous. But also, legal guns harm people too and are dangerous to the women that we seek to serve, and we owe them more. And so with that, I will end and I will be happy to answer any questions and engage in conversation.
Thanks so much, Greta, and for everyone for really your wonderful insights. Greta, you kind of touched on this a little bit, and I kind of want to dig in a little bit more about the specificity of firearm laws and how sometimes they can be vague, right? Or they're not completely implemented or followed through well in terms of, who do you surrender to and how do you follow up on that, and whether or not you actually do follow up on that at all. And so I'm curious about what everyone thinks about how the lack of specificity in these laws affect women, and then who has the ability to step in and fill in the gaps, right? So if the law isn't specific enough, who then is actually fulfilling, hopefully, what the law is supposed to be doing?
Well, I can start. I mean, I think that for our area, for domestic violence, right, it's the coalitions, right? They're the lobby arm if it's a state issue. Federally, there is a consortium of us, of the National Technical Assistance Providers and resource centers that are formed under the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence. So we listen to the field about what are the gaps, how are they not being implemented, what can we do more? And that's how we got almost $40 million more in the Violence Against Women Act in order to provide more funding for culturally specific organizations so they can, tell us boots on the ground and enhance their work for communities of color.
The only thing I would add is that I think there has been a recognition for those of us who have worked on this issue on the legislative side is that the implementation, as Director Gardner just described, is a real issue, that we can pass legislation that we intend to achieve a certain objective, and implementation, and for a variety of reasons, can be either unequal or challenging. And one of the things that was included in the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was $750 million specifically to help implementation of provisions that try to keep guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, both through things like mental health courts, drug courts, veterans courts, and of course, extreme protection orders, coupled with, of course, due process protection. So I think there was a recognition that even statutes that articulate a good standard and should save lots of lives are not always implemented perfectly or well. And sometimes, it's just difficult for people to navigate for all the reasons that Greta just described. And hopefully putting more resources in the hands of experts and community stakeholders that do this work, that have really important experiences and cultural sensitivities to help in the successful implementation will make a difference.
And if I
Thank
may
you.
say, lawyers, we so often see survivors going into pro se proceedings and not being successful. We know statistically that actually you have the best outcome in a protection order hearing with a lawyer, but you have a better outcome if you're pro se than to have an attorney who's not educated on domestic violence dynamics.
That's interesting. That makes a lot. I mean, it makes sense, right? That people who are trained in this can help you the best. Who knew, right? Congressman, where do you think gun safety legislation is as a priority for the House and Senate Democratic leadership, respectively?
I think it remains a big priority for the House Democratic leadership. I think it does for the Senate Democratic leadership as well, but I can speak more authoritatively about the House. It remains an important priority for the American people. We hear about it from our constituents. People are living with the reality of gun violence in their communities. There are well-publicized mass shootings almost every day in this country, but there are shootings which don't get a lot of publicity, which happen every single day in communities that are, people are aware of and experiencing and being harmed from, and in some communities really devastated from. So I think there's tremendous interest in this. It's a big priority for the House Democrats, but as fiercely as we are in terms of our commitment to doing something about it, unfortunately, the gun lobby has really, I'm fond of saying that the Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the gun lobby, but I think it's, mostly true. They have invested a lot of money in candidates and in Republican leadership that does not support basic, even wildly popular common sense gun safety legislation. And so they've been successful up until the Safer Communities Act in really stopping progress at all on any of these issues. The one area where I'm hopeful is the area we're speaking about today. I think there is some willingness to at least think about legislation which would attempt to keep guns out of the hands of people who are dangerous to themselves or others. Most of the really fierce gun advocates will say, we don't support any legislation that will infringe in any way or interfere in any way with a law-abiding citizen's right to have any firearm anywhere he or she wants. So we say, well, okay, well, then will you at least work with us on keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them, either because they are disqualified because of a prior criminal conviction or because they've evidenced some behavior that makes them dangerous themselves or others, like at least in that area. And we had some success in safer communities, not nearly enough, but I think there is some, at least, willingness to talk about these issues in a bipartisan way. And I see that's an area where if we're going to have any success with the Republican majority in the House, it would be in that area.
Thank you. I have a bunch of other questions I can always ask them if other people don't, but I do want to open the floor for other people who may have questions because I know the congressman can only stay until 1 o'clock. So I definitely want to leave time for other people to ask questions as well. So you can just raise your hand or put it in the chat. If you raise your hand and I'll say your name and then just unmute yourself so you can ask your question to whoever you want to ask your question to, and then just mute yourself again so that we don't have a ton of background noise. So from what I can tell, I think Donnie is one of the people who would like to ask a question.
Thank you. And thank you all for the presentation. It was really informative. So my question is, do we know how often extreme risk protection orders are actually used in the states that authorize them? And maybe a question for the congressman is, are there any attempts not just to incentivize the adoption of red flag laws like was done in the Safer Communities Act, but to incentivize states to, actually make use of the orders and to make sure that judges know that they're an option?
I am happy to take the first part of that question. So it's a great question. And what we know of the implementation of extreme risk protection orders is that they have been used over 20,000 times since they were first adopted. I mean, some states, Connecticut and Indiana, had what we would call like the pre-modern day version of extreme risk protection orders that were passed in the 90s. Connecticut has since made adoptions and amendments that have brought it more in line with the extreme risk protection orders we've seen since 2014. California passed the first modern version called their gun violence restraining order, and we've seen over the past almost 10 years since that more and more states are adopting this legislation. And as I mentioned, states like Michigan and Minnesota are considering that legislation in the 2023 session. What's interesting is that when we look at the sheer number of ERPOs, Florida has used ERPOs more than any other state, and it's really not even close. I actually was just looking at some data from Florida where it's been used at least 10,000 times since the Parkland shooting, which was the impetus for Florida's passage of that law with bipartisan support, signed into law by a Republican governor. So they've used it the most. When we look at per capita usage, Maryland has used extreme risk protection orders the most. And Maryland is, I believe, the only state where an ERPO has been used, or red flag law has been used in every single county in the state. So there's a lot of variation within states, among states, but every year that ERPOs continue to be implemented, and the more that there is dedicated funding, which now there luckily is, we've seen more usage, but also proper usage, because it's not just about the numbers, it's about whether they're being used in an appropriate way.
Looks like Professor Schiller has her hand up. She wants to go next, and then I'm happy to answer the congressional part.
Sure, no problem.
Okay, just on that, on Lisa Geller's presentation, two questions of statistics, and perhaps Greta Gardner can jump in. When we see statistics frequently on suicide by firearm, this is something we've had trouble sifting out. So there's some, majority of firearm deaths are suicide, or 2/3 are suicide by gun. We also know that domestic violence abusers shoot their families and bystanders and then shoot themselves. And so we've been trying to get a handle on how those deaths are characterized. Are they also included in the suicide number? Because I think sometimes people get a little bit more comfortable, sadly, with these numbers because they say, well, many of them are suicide. But we know in domestic violence that many abusers kill themselves after killing their family members. And that's something I'd ask you about the statistical part. And then also for Greta Gardner, or both of you, do we have any breakdown as to how that breaks out in socially constructed racial and ethnic communities? So we could, and then I think it would be good to transition to the congressperson. Thanks.
That's a great question. So you're right, most gun deaths are suicides. What we've seen during the pandemic was that there were pretty remarkable, in a terrible way, and historic increases in gun homicides. During the pandemic, there were also increases in gun suicides, but what we saw was that there were actually decreases in suicides by means other than a firearm. And there were noticeably, a smaller increase in homicides by means other than a firearm, which is all to say that the reason why we're seeing more suicides and homicides is because of guns. What we know is that the CDC does not break down to, the reason or the specific interaction from the suicide or the homicide or the police shooting or the unintentional shooting. We simply from the CDC get the numbers. There are other databases like the National Violent Death Reporting System, NVDRS, that is starting to roll out better data tools and looking at, specifically as it relates to intimate partner violence, domestic violence, the reason or the precipitating factor for the homicide or the suicide. It's not perfect. State level data, local level data tends to be better than these national databases. When I wrote my paper on domestic violence and mass shootings, one of the things that we looked at was perpetrators who died by suicide. And what we saw was that you were more likely in a mass shooting to die by suicide if you were a domestic violent mass shooting perpetrator. And we have numbers on that, and I can put a link to my study in the chat, but you're absolutely right that there is a connection between domestic violence and suicide, and we don't have good enough data to track when it's happening. But what I would say is that if someone dies by suicide while carrying out a mass shooting or another homicide, that is going to be reported as a suicide by the CDC. Where it gets trickier is when it's a police involved shooting, sometimes referred to as suicides by cop. It is not as clear cut to me how that is always getting reported in databases, because the law enforcement officer is the one that is shooting the individual. And so in my mind, it should be recorded as a police involved shooting, but it may sometimes be recorded as a suicide. So I'm not clear on how the CDC always handles that.
Thank you. Very helpful.
So just briefly, there's so much of a problem, I will just say that, in collecting data, particularly when we look at fatality review initiatives, even in local jurisdictions, about capturing the data correctly, even around race and ethnicity. I have sat in domestic violence fatality review teams where they have said, we don't know the race or ethnic background of the victim, so we're just going to guess. And I'm like, wait a minute, time out. Like, you can't do that. I think in an analogous situation, also some of the challenges that we're having with some of the data about whether or not a situation is a domestic violence situation is sometimes they're reduced to disorderly. Sometimes they're reduced to something that you can't tell that there's an partner relationship. So we can't even extract that, as well as like, okay, well, this escalated to this, or it was actually this, and it should have had this remedy, like malicious destruction, right? So I think that your point is well taken, is that we need to do a better job of capturing the data and providing a uniformity of what we're looking for, so that we can be as accurate as possible in our prevention and intervention strategies.
Thank you.
And the only thing I would add to that is, there was, what complicated some of the data collection, of course, is a federal prohibition. One of the only places I've ever seen a federal government preclude the collection of data, and it related to gun injuries or gun deaths, that we finally repealed and appropriated some money in the last Congress so that we could actually collect good data to develop good public policy in response to that data. I mean, this was an example of the power of the gun lobby. They prevented or they were successful in persuading Congress from even allowing agencies of the federal government to collect information and share it about gun-related injuries. On your first question about the extreme risk protection orders, I think there's a lot of evidence that they save lives and they work. And as Lisa said, they're different in lots of jurisdictions, but they essentially or effectively work. I think, we had a proposal that we passed out of the House that was sponsored by Congresswoman McBath. I was a proud co-sponsor, that created a federal extreme risk protection provision that you could go to federal court and get one of these orders. We passed it out of the House. It was not taken up in the Senate. It was not included. Part of the compromise in the Safer Communities to get bipartisan support was to incentivize states to both develop, implement, and then successfully maintain these systems, and so appropriating money to do it. But clearly the better answer would be to require every state to have one. And if they didn't have one, to have the federal government have one in its place. And I hope that that will eventually become the law of the land.
And one other thing that most laws are silent on is when guns are used simply to threaten or coerce. You can just put it on a table and that sends a message, and that is violence, but we have nothing to capture that as well.
Does anyone else have other questions? Because I have a follow-up, particularly I'm curious about, and I think this is both like state and federal, right, constituents. Is there any kind of sense that constituents have any idea that these laws are actually work and are good for citizens, and if not, what do we think can be done, right, to kind of spread that information to get people to understand the point of these laws and that they are actually effective when used properly. And that could be for Lisa or the congressman or Greta.
Sure. Yeah, go ahead, Congressman. Take it.
No, I was going to say, look, I think on the broad proposition of, is it a good idea to have a way to prevent someone who is exhibited some behavior which makes you worry that he's going to hurt somebody or hurt him or herself, that most people think like having a system that allows a gun to be removed is a great idea. So I don't think we have to convince the American people that it's a sensible public policy. I think it's mostly about making people understand that this is available to them and making sure we have people in the system who are administering the program who are sensitive to how it's supposed to work and don't minimize concerns about threats or the use of a firearm or threats of violence. And, there's a certain kind of cultural predisposition against people who often come forward with concerns about guns. Law enforcement's trained with guns. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff there that we have to be sure that it's being implemented. But I don't think we have to do anything to convince people that this is good public policy. It's really making sure people who are implementing it are doing it properly and making sure people know that it's available. You have this very small group of people who think, and this is the argument they make against these extreme protection order provisions, is, oh, you're taking a gun away from someone who hasn't committed a crime, who, has only, expressed some intention to do it, but hasn't actually done it. And, this sort of idea of like, you should wait until he's actually done the crime to remove the gun. It's a little bit too late then, but, pushing back hard on that, saying we have lots of other ways that we prevent people who are dangerous from acting on their intention to hurt people. We do it all the time in a variety of different settings, and we ought to do it with the most dangerous kind of device, a firearm.
Yeah, I've also read in like committee hearings at the state level that for those who are not fans of these, right, that it will be abused, right? Well, how do you know for certain that that person is actually going to hurt themselves, right? And how can we trust that it's not just going to be taken away from someone who would never do anything, right? So,
and actually, Caitlin, just on that, we included in our in our provisions a penalty for someone who falsely makes a claim, to say like, if you go into court and you lie because you're trying to get back at someone, and that's proven, you've committed a crime and you'll be punished for it. The fact is that no one could give us an example where that actually happened. It's a good thing to sort of squawk about, but it actually is not the way it works in real life. But we put in a provision to say, look, there will be a penalty. There already is a penalty if you go into court and lie under oath and lie in an affidavit, you've committed perjury. But we made it explicit in this provision so that we could refute that argument. But I think it's people who just don't believe in any even modest limitations on the possession or use of a firearm.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree there. And actually, every state's ERPO law has a perjury clause in it if you violate it. And so there's no ERPO statute that exists in any of the states that have it that allow it to be used willy-nilly. And we know that that's just a talking point and an excuse to not implement these laws and not support them. And Congressman is right that we don't have to convince the public that these are good. We know from all the public opinion polling that's out there that people support extremist protection orders. But what we also know from public opinion is that people don't know what they are until they hear about them, and then they support them. So it's getting the education and awareness out there, but mostly to the system actors that are implementing ERPOs and that are going to be directly corresponding with the eligible petitioners in their state. And so I will, I think I kind of plugged it at the beginning, but as part of the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, my team, my center at Johns Hopkins, the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions, got a grant from the Department of Justice to enact a national clearinghouse and a national extreme risk protection order resource center. And so I am going to be co-leading that with one of my colleagues who's an attorney, because I'm a public health person. And the two of us are going to be working directly with state administering agencies that already, get funding under the Burn JAG grant system, and with implementers at the local and state level who have experience working on ERPOs and other crisis intervention orders. So there, is public support for these. There are people that indicate a willingness to use them when they learn about them, and now there's funding to use them. So I think that this is a good time to be working in the gun violence prevention movement.
And if I may, I think in the education and the public awareness that the dispossession usually is temporary or for a finite period of time. We are not generally talking about you may never own a firearm ever again in your life unless you have a lifetime protection order, right? I mean, so I think that there's a little bit of a miseducation out there that, you know, we're just summarily taking guns from anybody who is an abuser, potentially could be abuser, and no, and never will they ever have them ever again. And I think that that's incorrect information.
Carrie, I think you were next.
Thank you. So this is a question probably that Greta may be able to sort of answer first and then maybe others, but I'd like to sort of take a step back. We know, right, that folks that are convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors can't have firearms, but it is the conviction part that is quite hard, right? Like it's not enough to have a history. It's not enough to be accused. It's not enough to be arrested. It's a conviction. I used to work in a prosecutor's office, not as a prosecutor, but in that office, and it's a hard thing to do, right? Successfully prosecuting domestic violence cases is a challenge. So Greta, I'm wondering if there is something, and other panelists as well, I know the other panelists also have expertise in this, but Greta mentioned she used to be a prosecutor, things that can be done to help sort of earlier on to sort of successfully prosecute cases so that folks with dangerous histories are precluded from having firearms and perhaps be held accountable earlier. And we don't have to get to some of this later stages of abuse and violence. So I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Thank you.
Sure. Great question. And it's so funny because now as I do the technical assistance and training, like in the 90s when I was a prosecutor, we used to just melt the firearms. And they're like, you can't do that anymore. I was like, really? Why? That's so unfortunate. So yeah, I think for me, a lot of what we talk about when we work with prosecutors is that trust and rapport building, right? Because you want to know like how many guns, because you know there may be a gun that was involved in the incident, but they may have access to almost, I've worked on one case where in Texas where they had 60 guns, right? And so being able to get all of those guns is really important. So it's really about trust building and rapport building with the survivors. Oh, and Congresswoman, sir, do you want to have the last closing words before you leave? Is there anything you wanted to say?
Yes, as we're approaching the 1 o'clock hour.
Oh, no, I didn't. I was only doing that to say goodbye. No, I feel very honored to be on a panel with these extraordinary women who are doing such important work. And it makes me recognize that if we're going to see any real progress in reducing gun violence and domestic violence in this country, it's in close partnership with the extraordinary advocates and experts on this panel. So thank you for everything you're doing, and hopefully we'll together have more victories. And thank you, Professor Schiller, for including me.
Thank you for all your work on the Hill, sir. Thank you.
My pleasure.
So I would say, you know, the rapport building, because the last thing you want is to be working your case and trying to prevent another incident and or to keep her safe, and the survivor fails to appear or recants on this on the witness stand. You know, there's still a little bit of controversy within the prosecutorial world around going forward without a victim. You know, you can still use out of court statements. There's a few more hoops that you have to jump through, but you can still do it. Or to dismiss the case based on, you know, whatever's best for her safety. And I'm using her just in this particular example for ease. I guess you know, because I'm thinking too, like we know that some prosecution offices have gone to the extreme of even arresting survivors to compel their testimony. In New Orleans, they were sued for doing that, and now they may not do that any longer. They have to have a judicial sign off in order to, and they have to provide testimony as to why they want the warrant or the body attachment. In the reauthorization of VAWA, I worked very closely with the National District Attorneys Association. We are trying to dissuade that practice. So if you receive VAWA funding, that has to be the least used measure, and you have to have a protocol that prevents using that measure. So to kind of wrap it all up, I think rapport building with the survivor, she is the best expert on what keeps her safe. And if you want to be a participant in that, and if you're interested in making sure that that offender is being held accountable, and that's going to differ for different people at different times and different places. It's going to have different meanings. But if our main goal is to get that weapon away, based on the statistics of what we know, is to let her be the expert, follow the policies and protocols that are in place and the laws, so that the survivor and the offender feel like they're being treated fair. We also have another project that we're working on, racial equity and procedural fairness in the courtrooms, because what we know is that if people feel like they are being treated fairly and or the process was fairly, they are more likely to comply. And so if there's a stay away order, no contact order, relinquish your firearm, they're more likely to comply if they feel like they were treated humanely and fairly. But Lisa, what else would you suggest?
Do you also think, though, that lethality assessments could be an important tool for this, right? In trying to get, victims to cooperate or really understand, right, exactly how much danger they're in?
So that's an interesting question. That's probably a whole nother webinar. Yes, I mean, we support risk and lethality assessments. We do know that not all of them are culturally responsive. So while it is a broad brush, it is not necessarily always going to give you the information that you need. We also know that Black survivors in particular don't always identify as a victim or a survivor of domestic violence. So that's going to skew some of the answers as well. I think like anything else, it is a tool, but you can't rely on just the tool specifically. And I have seen the tool be used, and in the interview, there has been information given that maybe a child was in the room during a domestic violence incident, even if it was in the past, and child welfare services get involved and remove the child from the home. So there are lots of collateral and unintended consequences that we, again, on another project are working on to make sure that lethality assessments are done in a way that are fair and equitable to communities of color, so that there aren't collateral consequences and the safety is the most important thing. But Lisa, what were you going to say?
I was just going to agree with everything you said and really highlight the importance of having as many tools as possible, because we don't know what a survivor is going to want in their particular situation, but making sure that they are presented with all of the options, because as Greta said, and what we say all the time in domestic violence prevention is the survivor is the best person to know what they need to keep them safe. And it's never the intention, or should never be the intention of us as outsiders or people with good intentions to say what they need to do in a specific situation. And I know that's been some of the pushback with extreme risk protection orders, is that law enforcement can petition for them in every single state where they exist. Most states have given that petitioning power to other people, to family, household members, including survivors, to clinicians are getting that power in, a growing number of states, 5 states now. I think there are definite pros of that situation, of having more petitioners, such as not having law enforcement be the first person to initiate something. I think that that's an extreme benefit. But I think it also can be tricky when we're opening, the door to more people who can potentially get involved in a situation in a way that actually exacerbates things for a survivor. And so no matter what the specific statute looks like on the extreme risk protection order, or even on the domestic violence protection order, it should really be with the motivation of survivor autonomy first, and presenting, a plethora of options to make sure that that individual knows what they have available to them in their state, and then can ultimately decide what keeps them the safest.
Thank you. Howard Winston had put in the chat, would a strong tripartite approach, including domestic protection, school mental health resources, and community violence prevention programs, be effective in reducing gun violence? Not sure, Lisa or Greta, who wants to take that first?
I think, yes, of course. I think that we need to address this in ways beyond what we would think of as typical gun violence prevention policy. We know that a lot of gun violence in this country is driven by underemployment employment or unemployment is driven by, a lack of affordable healthcare, access to housing, food insecurity. It is so much more complicated than just we'll remove the gun and all gun violence will end. But we do have to address the gun. And so when, particularly, unfortunately, Republican lawmakers want to address our gun violence problem by addressing everything beyond the gun. And that's just not going to solve this crisis either. So it has to be, again, a framework of policies that address mental health for sure, particularly when we're talking about mental health for youth, when we're talking about suicide prevention. That's critically important. But mental health care alone will not solve gun violence, because most gun violence, particularly interpersonal violence, is not driven by mental illness or diagnosable mental illness. So again, it's so complicated. And I think it's a good idea to approach this in a multifaceted way by including provisions for mental health care, for community violence intervention, for school resources and school safety provisions. But we also have to physically remove firearms from people. That can't be left out. There are some people who cannot have a firearm and should not have a firearm. And so the removal aspect is going to be critical there.
And I think there's one other component. I mean, I absolutely agree. A multi-pronged approach, as many options as possible, but we're really missing the critical piece around this is what are our morals and values systems around women, right? I mean, we're talking about femicide. And why is it that we have such high domestic violence homicide statistics with firearms? Yes, there is access in the United States. And so that makes it, the weapon of choice. But we just heard also that if a firearm's not available, that there are other weapons that are utilized to kill women. And why are we continuing to see the same rate, 3 women per day for forever, right? And so even though we have the Violence Against Women Act, we put all of this money into programming and this and that, it seems like we take 5 steps forward, maybe in the reduction, but we're also taking 10 steps back because we're still seeing the homicides. And why is that? And I forgive the word logical because it's not logical, it's irrational in all shapes and forms. But why is it when there's interpersonal conflict, when there's interpersonal power and control coercion, that killing a woman is the next action? And why are we in one way, shape, or form complicit and are condoning that? Because we haven't talked about the women piece. We've talked about telling girls to be safe. Here are the red flags in relationships. Don't do this, don't do that. Have 10 people around you when you're walking down the street. But we're not talking about what our value system is around protecting women. The greatest risk factor for injury, homicide, or harm is being a woman.
I think that's a great transition almost to talking about Rahimi. And I don't know I think we touched a little bit on the Fifth Circuit case. I believe Congressman Cicilline brought it up, but and not to take over Caitlin as your moderator, but at all. But
I have it on my list of questions.
Oh, okay. Well, I just wanted to for those who aren't familiar with what's happening in the courts too, and I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to let Greta take it, but I'll just give my 2 cents on it, is that right now, because of what, the Supreme Court has ruled on how we interpret gun laws, we're left in a position in 2023 where we're determining if gun laws are valid based on what white men wrote in the 1700s. And we're interpreting whether it's constitutional to remove firearms under a domestic violence protection order based on a time when women were property, based on a time when Black women, Black men could still legally be slaves, people could still legally have slaves. And I think that's fundamentally, for the fundamental issue here and the fundamental problem here that Greta is talking about is, why aren't we talking about the fact that women aren't valued equally? And now we're reverting back to interpreting laws from a time when women were property and Black women in particular were property. And so it's it's infuriating and it's problematic and it's troubling. And the Fifth Circuit ruling, which, you know, only applies to 3 states currently, could be the new normal, depending on how this Supreme Court rules on it, because it's already been appealed to the Supreme Court.
And, you know, wife beating, right, which is what domestic violence essentially was called, right, in, you know, the 1700s, 1800s, right, was not out. The first state to do it is Maryland in the late 1800s, and then you still have all the rest of the states to do it. So you're talking of almost a century after this point, right, that, you know, the Constitution is written that you are outlawing some form of domestic violence, and even still, you don't have any of the resources that are really necessary to truly address it, right? Because, you know, you're not allowed to divorce, you're not allowed, the shelters are just not there for women at that time. So it's really, you know, kind of insane, right, to think that you would apply that standard of how women were living there during that time and how they were treated, to whether or not now we should remove firearms from that situation. Sorry,
Lisa,
Greta.
you did a wonderful recitation. I think the only things that I would add is, like, even, you know, what was it, 1994, that all 50 states outlawed marital rape? I mean, 1994, I was in law school, right? I mean, and then I had a pro bono case in Texas where a woman was giving birth. Her husband and she were estranged. He was a part of an enforcement agency and came to the hospital with his firearm and said that he was taking the baby. And they asked him to please just put his firearm in his vehicle, but then he could visit with the child. So we have that trauma. And then we also have, I was working with her attorney trying to get a protection order and also to trigger the divorce, because in Texas, you cannot get a divorce if you are pregnant. You have to wait till the baby's born. And so as I was trying to advocate for all of the moving pieces, her attorney said, well, what's the baby's name? And I said the name. They said, why is that the name? I said, because she's going to revert to her maiden name when she gets the divorce in the next 60 days. And he said, the baby is always the father's name. Tell her to go and change that birth certificate back or to the father's name, and then I'll file the divorce. And I was in a mad scramble to get her another attorney. So, you know, when we talk about all the ways that women experience violence in trying to be safe and trying to be independent, it's almost impossible in so many ways, right? And that has to change. So we have to be working on things in parallel streams, the firearms issue, and also how we treat women in this country. We have great window dressing, right? But we're really not addressing how women are treated in this country. And it should be unconscionable and unacceptable that women are dying, 3 women a day, by the hands of people who say, I love you. It is absolutely unconscionable.
Thank you for that. No, it is, you know, you kind of brought it down to its most basic level, right? And which is what we all forget about, is that it says something about our society that this is still a problem. It's been still a problem. And despite, you know, federal, state, and local attempts to address it, it's a cultural problem. And the culture is a heck of a lot harder to change, right? And many laws may not do it. And they're not going to they certainly haven't done it over the past, you know, almost 30 years since VAWA was passed. Another question I was thinking about is what happens when specific law enforcement, right, decide not to enforce something, right? So there's some research out there about like sheriffs, right? And sheriffs not actually believing in removing firearms from these situations. It doesn't even just be sheriffs, but it's other law enforcement, because, you know, they may not, you know, agree with the order, or, you know, may not think it's necessary. I mean, what happens? Is there anything to be done in those situations? And what happens in those situations when they happen?
So I had that issue too. And, you know, I mean, I would love, you know, almost kind of like if you have a medical anomaly or issue, you get a team of doctors that come together and they round robin about how to solve this problem. I wish for every domestic violence incident, like, oh my God, a lawyer and an advocate and a prosecutor, like this whole team to address that. And I was representing somebody in a protection order, and I asked the court to please put in the order for the law enforcement agencies to go to the house and remove the weapon. And the judge said, absolutely not. So I had to call Equitas, and the Battered Women's Justice Project, to please send information and research to the judges' chambers to give her the authority that she was looking for to remove the weapons, or at least to tell law enforcement. She said she wouldn't. And so as her advocate and her attorney, I went to the local law enforcement. I had to talk to the commander on duty. And I said, here is the protection order. Can you please go to the shed? Can you please take the weapon that's in the box? That like the specificity of where it is so clear. We're trying to prevent a domestic violence homicide. But unless you have that level of advocacy in your community, whether it's a community-based organization or a lawyer, or you happen to know somebody who has a little bit of gravitas, it's just not happening. But Lisa, your experience.
That's so challenging. I mean, we've seen it, the Second Amendment sanctuaries be declared in states. I will say, as a word of hope there, when we look at Second Amendment sanctuaries and their data on use of specifically extremist protection orders, we have seen that even though a jurisdiction might declare themselves a Second Amendment sanctuary, they might still utilize some of the laws, particularly if it keeps them safe. So we know of, there's been research in Colorado on the use of their extremist protection order law that shows that Second Amendment sanctuaries did still use the law. I am writing a paper looking at the implementation of Virginia's extremist protection order law, where we saw similar things, that some of these counties that said we won't enforce this, we refuse to, did actually use it. But I suspect that it might have been in a situation where it's beneficial to law enforcement themselves to keep themselves safe, and maybe not, with the best intentions of the person that is looking for protection. So the implementation side of things is so tricky. I remember working with some folks in Georgia. They have a lot of dedicated advocates and even, U.S. attorneys that care about the intersection of domestic violence and firearms, that said that they would go to court and try to get firearms removed, which is, not easy in a state like Georgia. And the judge said, well, he needs to go hunting. So that was their rationale for why a firearm removal shouldn't happen for someone who had perpetrated domestic violence, because he still apparently had a right to go hunting. And that's what we're up against here. Those are the anecdotes that I just won't forget, because they seem so, insane to me and probably to most people on this call. But that is how this is working in practice in a lot of states that don't have protections, and even in states that do have protections.
And this doesn't even count, like right now I have a survey out to judges across the United States, and so far over 200 have responded, and over a third of them have said they do not follow up on firearm removal orders. They just issue them and then off they go. And less than 20% will follow up within a week. I mean, if they do follow up, there could be a third said it was no set timeline. Like maybe they'll follow up, but I don't know when it will happen. I'll do it at some point. And then over a third said they don't follow up at all, right? So it's like, well, how do you know it's actually happening? How do you know what's happening to that gun, and that the person actually knows that it needs to be taken away? So just really concerning.
And
Carrie,
another piece to that is third-party transfers. So even if there isn't a law enforcement agency who is taking possession of the firearm, certain jurisdictions, you are allowed to do third-party transfers. And what was happening was no one was following up on that. No one was admonishing the third party of like, here are your responsibilities, and should you allow possession to go back to the offender, this is what will happen to you as well. And so we had to create a whole protocol and affidavit around that for third parties who were taking possession of the abuser's weapons, because we didn't even know if that was happening, right? And so the survivor may not even say anything because she's so afraid of like, I trusted the system to help protect me, and they were supposed to take his weapons, but nobody said anything, nobody provided any instructions, so he still has them, so I'm going to be silent and pray that I live.
Carrie?
think that another thing that applies specifically to domestic violence survivors is the issue with court jurisdiction and different levels of jurisdiction that can really complicate this, right? Like a domestic violence survivor may move as a part of her survival strategy. And that can complicate the enforcement of orders of protection across state lines or across county lines, even within the same state. And I think this is an area where the congressman is now off the call, but like this sort of interjurisdictional coordination and increase of technical assistance seems like something that the ERPO movement can really like learn from the order of protection movement as it's being implemented to hopefully sort of avoid some of these enforcement and jurisdictional issues. It's just really, I've done so much sort of educating with sheriffs, like, no, that really is a violation of the order of protection. No, because the order is in one particular state. It turns out you can enforce it in your state because it's a contract, right? Like, and these things, I think it's multi-pronged. I think some of it is the enforcer just, truly doesn't know. And then I think it runs the spectrum to resistance and perhaps some people using that as an excuse to not enforce that order for whatever reason. I think there are a myriad of them. But I'm wondering, Greta and Lisa, do you see any of those issues as something that we can sort of learn from that become important in future sort of thinking about federal policy making? I sort of feel like it might start there, but maybe not. Maybe a bottom up is also good, but it seems like a top down might be good in that particular kind of arena to keep victims safe no matter where they are and different stages of their lives.
So you're assuming that all survivors are legally allowed to move. So for example, in Texas, if you have children in common, they have geographic restrictions. You may not live more than 120 miles away from the non-custodial parent. And they also have jury trials. So there have been incidences where there have been jury trials because mom wanted to go to her support system or got a new job to be able to independently, take care of her family. And the jury has said no. So there's that. The second thing is,
well, so I'm not necessarily assuming that. I will just say, so I'm from Texas, fun fact. Right. And sometimes the abuser is also the person who moves. So I was involved in an issue with an abuser in Bexar County over the weekend, and the woman lives in Fort Bend County, right? And so he moved, and they're more than 120 miles away, but there's still all manner of problems, and there are these jurisdictional issues happening between counties. So yes, there is that perhaps baked into my question, but like people can move across county lines and we still have these jurisdictional issues and sheriff saying, well, that order isn't here, or that conviction wasn't in our county, or, I don't know where the person is when they're doing this. So so there are then additional issues as far as the court is concerned. So like so yes, that is a limitation that could reduce proximity, but it wouldn't necessarily mean that this problem doesn't exist.
No, you're absolutely right. I just wanted to put that out there, that's for folks to know that that's not even always possible. So you're right. So the second thing is around, there's so many problems, right? Like where do you start? Well, I'm going to let Lisa talk. I've been talking a lot, but it's almost like user error, right? I mean, there are folks who are doing all the right things. And so I think your question is, how do you get folks who are either not wanting to follow the law, or who are not believing the survivor to believe the survivor? I mean, I've seen incidences where they've had the protection order in hand and showing the police, and the police are like, I don't know where that is, or I don't think that that's a real order. And then it puts the onus on the survivor to go and validate a court order in order to get protection, right? So my answer is always going to be like, get a lawyer, if you can. And the more pro bono attorneys that we have that can, advocate to that level, I support it. So, but Lisa?
I wanted to actually expand on your comment the chat or have you expand on Court Watch, because I think Court Watch is a really interesting program that a lot of people might not be familiar with, and also just in general using the media. But in Montgomery County in Maryland, which is, near, on the DC border, there's a great Court Watch program. And their goal is to, literally go to court and watch and report on what happens and what judges say and what judges do in order to report back to the community on how these DV cases in particular are being handled. And I'm sure Greta can explain it much better than I can, but there is, there's data and there's report from Court Watch that Court Watch programs and their presence of being in court and that accountability has resulted in better outcomes in a lot of cases. And so those programs are often driven by retired older women who are using, their free time to do good for the community. I wish that there would be funding behind a lot of these initiatives, because I think we should not always have to rely on people that are donating their time, but we should, compensate people for doing these great deeds. So I encourage people to look into Court Watch programs and see if that could be a strategy that you can start in your community or tell people about. And yeah, students can be trained. Yeah, it's a great, I'm at Johns Hopkins now, so we're always looking for ways to engage students who want to have practicum projects or graduate school projects. I think it's a great project to give students if you're at a university as well.
Yeah, and again, you did a wonderful job, Lisa. Like, I have nothing to add around the Court Watch thing. I think to get to your question though about accountability, right? So there are ways to hold systems and stakeholders and actors accountable, right? But in many ways that can still be unsafe for survivors to do that. And so a lot of times, particularly in the territories where we do work, where, the environment's very small and everybody knows everybody, et cetera, et cetera. I guess the question then points to, how do you change the minds of people who are committed to misunderstanding you or to not helping you? And that we have to be really more strategic around that, right? And to like, as a technical assistance provider, as a policy person, what are the things that we can put in place? Because it may not be the survivor who does that, like we're talking about Court Watches and, other things, but how do we hold those folks? Because it is folks who make up the systems who fail survivors on a daily basis. I have to give a lot more thought to give a more intelligent answer. It's a complicated question.
I think that was a pretty good start, Greta. You've said some really wonderful things today, both of you. Did either of you have any final thoughts? Because we're in our last 2 minutes before we wrap up.
No, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. And for the collaboration that I think is about to happen amongst those here on the call. And yeah, go forth, do well, do what you can, take care of yourselves. That's the other piece that I see so often is that, as a prosecutor, I burned out in 3 years. And so sometimes people are not helpful because they just have been absorbing so much pain and so much trauma that they can't respond effectively. And so I think that there's room and time and space for us to work on that as well with those who provide services and responses to make sure that they're doing the very best that they can for the people that we seek to serve. But thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you for being here. Lisa, did you have anything to add or?
That was beautiful. I'll leave it with Greta's words and just thank you for having us to talk about this.
No, thank you both so much. And we had already thanked Congressman David Cicilline. The next panel is entitled Bearing the Burden, Women of Color, Guns, and the Legal System. And that is taking place on Wednesday, April 26th from 12 to 1:30. And you can register for that, which is on the ARMS website. And you can also share out the link of this that was live streamed. Please do, and disseminate widely for people who couldn't be here, because really there was just some wonderful and really thoughtful responses and action items that we can all take to kind of do better and be better in responding to violence against women, particularly firearm violence. So thank you all, and I hope you all have a good day.
And thank you to Caitlin for moderating. And the link for our future seminars, we have 2 more in this series, is in the chat. So if you'd like to RSVP, that link is there for you. So please, we'd love to have you back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.